You're listening to the Skylight Books podcast. We're an independent, general interest bookstore putting great reads in the hands of people in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hosted by resident Skylighters, we're here to bring you new and exciting author conversations, group reads, and bookseller chats. Happy listening. We're doing it. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special preview launch event for Disciples, which is being published by Fantagraphics. Benjamin Marra is the author of several acclaimed graphic novels from Fantagraphics, including Terror Assaulter, OMWOT, Night Business, and American Blood. He received a BFA in illustration from Syracuse University, studied in Florence, Italy, and earned his MFA degree in illustration from the School of Visual Arts. He lives in Montreal. David Birke is a screenwriter known for the films Elle, Slender Man, and 13 Sins. He lives in Tarzana with his wife and 2 daughters. And Nicholas McCarthy is a writer and director known for The Pact, At the Devil's Door, and The Prodigy. And we are so excited to have all of them with us this evening. Say hello, gents.
Hi.
Hello.
So as everyone knows, this book is not quite out yet. And so we are going to try and have a conversation that isn't very spoiler heavy, because there are some very fun and interesting and exciting and horrific things that happen, and we want you to experience them for yourselves. So let's go ahead and start with maybe Ben, you telling us about where this story idea came from and how this book sort of came to be.
Sure. So, the story idea came from these 2 gentlemen who are incredible writers. And I was introduced to them through mutual friend, John Schoenfelder. I was telling John how much I loved Paul Verhoeven's movie Elle, and John was like, well, I know the screenwriter of that movie. Do you want to meet him? So he introduced me to David, and then David and I were talking, and we were sort of talking about some projects that we could possibly collaborate on. And then John suggested this script that he had written with Nick called Disciples. And I read it, and it blew my mind, and I could totally see it as a graphic novel. And the reason why I wanted to adapt it was I felt like with some of my books, I was falling into a little bit of a groove, into kind of a pattern. Excuse me. And this story was one that was so well told, but it was something that I would have never written for myself. So I thought it was an interesting challenge, and I just wanted to collaborate with these 2 guys because it's such a great story. And like I said, it just sort of like came as I was reading it. I could kind of visualize and see it in my mind, what the pages would be like, and so I was just very inspired. And then I met with these guys, and we talked a lot about the story itself, but they just sort of were like, go crazy, do whatever you want. And I was very meticulous in my adaptation of it. And it took a while. It took a couple of years for me to finally complete it, but now we're done, and here we are.
And then for David and Nick, having written a story that most of your stories end up in a film visual medium, what was the idea, or what was running through your head when someone was like, maybe this will be a graphic novel? What was that sort of different idea like when it came to you?
Well, it was a surreal thing, and it still is a surreal thing. Like, I think when David and I both read the first sort of version of it that was sent, it was uncanny how faithful, Ben was to it. And I guess, the strange thing about it is like that there's a relationship between these mediums, right? Pictures that tell stories. That's what the cinema is. And so it's as if someone directed our movie in still images, And in in Ben's particular style, which is, I didn't know Ben's work. And then John, who was the producer on the movie, gave us Night Business to read. And when I read that one, it was so insane, that book. I was like, this guy can do anything he wants. I mean, David, maybe we should tell also like the story of how we ended up writing this thing in the first place too. Like,
yeah. Well, basically, well, to go way back, I wrote a script like pretty much when I was fresh out of UCLA, like this is like 25 years ago, and I wrote a script that a young Alyssa Milano was going to do, like
Wow.
a teenage Alyssa Milano, and then but it didn't happen. I think her mother said there was going to be nudity in it, and then her mother said no more nude scenes after Embrace of the Vampire. I think another movie that she made around that time. She was on a kick, I think, at that period. But there were always I basically have a kind of a perverse fear of letting anything go to waste. So I always cannibalize things for parts. Basically, it's like the Indian ethic of, eating every part of the animal or something. So I basically, we were with Nick, we were talking about like working on something. And so I kind of hoped to kind of like get the ball rolling by mentioning this old script of mine that nothing ever happened with, that had a couple of interesting elements in it. So then I just kind of told Nick this story in a coffee house, and then he called me a couple of days later and told me he was writing it and it was coming along really well. And so then I said, "Oh, okay. I guess this is the thing we're doing then." So then he pretty much did half a draft or a full draft. I don't remember. And then I did a draft, and we just kind of like went back a few times, and then ended up with this script that was basically half him and half me, and hopefully like a nice marriage of that. But also I think Nick already said this, but the main thing though is that this book is really Ben Marra's baby. This is his work. When I heard that he was doing this, just what amazed me was the amount of work that this was going to be. And I was just blown away that somebody was going to invest that kind of 2 years of work on making this thing. And he of course did a phenomenal job beyond what I could have imagined possible. Starting with this, it was basically just an unproduced script that was laying around, and he took it and turned it into a dare I say, a work of art. So I was just very, very impressed by all that. And and so I almost feel like an interloper even talking about it, because this is really, really Ben's thing, basically. Yeah. So that I think that's sort of the gist of the background.
I should say too, like specifically, I think maybe Ben, you could probably speak to this. Like, you connected sort of with what was in her story in a way, on a sort of psychic level. And why it was a great experience sort of coming up with the story is that, when you collaborate with someone, the whole idea is that you're not looking to work with someone who's going to agree with you, that, they're going to bring whatever they, whoever they are to it. And so when David and I did meet in this coffee shop, he specifically, we sort of want to avoid what exactly is happening in this story, but David specifically described this idea in this story that he had never kind of done anything with, which was about someone who had lived so long that they forgot who they were and had become a different person. And then I had told him that I had been working on a story that I never really finished or done anything with, about someone who was living trapped inside of a plywood box. and those were like those two things together. And we were in a coffee shop in the San Fernando Valley, which is where David grew up. And we started to talk about the horror movies made in the Valley in the 70s, I remember. And it was sort of like this sort of grubby, horror movies that were, like The Death Master and the Toolbox Murders, and the sort of films that like where something terrible is happening in this sort of very sort of almost banal, pre-planned, California environment. And it was like all those things getting brought together. And why it was, I think it turned into something that maybe Ben started to respond to, is that we weren't getting paid to do this. Like, I had met David because he had been paid to write a script for a remake of a French film that I was attached to direct. And then this was just like me coming to him with this idea about someone in a plywood box, and he had this thing about this person that lived forever. And then it sort of just kept going. And when I would work with him, like there was one particular time when I just knew, and I think, David, you just started to write the first movie you wrote for Paul Verhoeven then, I think, when we were doing this. I think you were just starting to, and I sort of knew why Paul Verhoeven was interested in working with you, because there was a moment when I was like, I had sort of written the first draft, and again, without getting into spoilers, I said something like, I don't know, we should find some way to sort of express that she has this attachment to this thing that happened in her past, and she kind of can't let it go. And David, without like batting an eye, was like, yeah, well, maybe she's having sex with her boyfriend and like cuts him and is like licking at the blood, and that's the only way she can come. And I was like, all right, so this is like immediately where this person is going. And, but there's a freedom in some ways when there isn't any constraints we just wanted to write something that we thought was interesting. And I think maybe that's why all that chemistry came together for Ben, who clearly from Night Business and the other work of his I'd seen had a similar sort of perverse sensibility, So.
And Ben, before I have you jump in and answer that, maybe you can speak to, I'm sure these guys have there's pushback on things in the film world a lot of the time, in terms of content, depending on who you're making something for, what you're making. And maybe, Ben, you could speak a little bit to your work in comics and with Fantagraphics. Like, these guys knew exactly what their story was, and you were able to, as they've said so graciously, faithfully commit it to the page as a work of art. And in what I've seen from Fantagraphics titles, there's not much pushback because they're letting people tell their stories. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about any of your work in comics and being able to tell a story faithfully from where it starts to where it ends.
Yeah. So, so with Fantagraphics, there is no pushback at all. They just want you to tell your story, and they will support you 1,000%. That's why Fantagraphics exists in the first place. And, like creators like me can just kind of, be able to tell their stories without any constraints, and they're 100% supportive in that endeavor. And they're just they're amazing in that regard. And then they put out super high quality books on top of it, and it's just they're just an amazing publishing company.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead,
Ben, with Night Business.
Yeah.
Do you ever get shit for the content in your work, which is, can be fairly extreme?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, for sure. It's not stuff that everyone is super psyched about. But I just come from a background of art training where you're kind of taught to go to those places, even if you yourself are really uncomfortable. Like, those are the places that you want to explore and test. And, not everybody really wants to go to those places with you all the time. So for me, I always felt like the reason why I started making comics was because I felt like comics had lost a lot of their teeth. I felt like the comics that I was seeing in Barnes and Noble, where I would go and read them without paying, due to my lack of, of income. I felt like they were comics that I absolutely hated, and so I started making comics because I was making the comics that I actually wanted to see and read, and that's comes from a tradition of the comics that made, Frederick Wertham unhappy in the 1950s, and inspired him to write the book Seduction of the Innocent, which led to comics being the only art form in America that created a body to self-censor itself. So I wanted to go back to that tradition of like EC Comics and the underground comics of the 60s, and tell some crazy stories that were in my mind. And so that's sort of what generated, the ideas for me making comics, but or where my inspiration came from. But the comics themselves, they're not super popular with some people.
I was really struck, by the way, of like, I remember when you were going to paint the cover for Disciples, and you had sent a bunch of sort of examples of the art that was on a lot of the Spanish comic art, and also like the sort of beautiful painted covers from those like 70s horror comics and stuff, like,
George Wilson in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys want me to pull the cover up and you can tell us a little bit about it? Talk about it a little bit? Okay. Sure.
There's a story, Ben. I have that thing.
Some visual element other than my face would be great. Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Now, Ben, let me tell you the story of part of the inspiration for this, which was, I was texting with you and you were talking about how you had thought about this cover, and I sent you first I sent you the poster for Short Night of Glass Dolls. It was a Giallo film, which had this sort of, and you really responded to that. But then I actually have it on my wall right behind me. Let me get it. It's this lobby card of this of this Italian. It's actually, and it's, see the, I don't know if with the glare, let's see if I can see it. If you can see, there's a knife right there.
Right. Yeah. That's it.
There it is. You can kind of see it. I just took a picture of that on my cell phone and I sent it to you.
Oh.
There it is. Yeah, and it's a movie called Lizard in a Woman's Skin.
Great movie.
And I just thought it was so cool that that I sent you that and you instantly were like that thing. But it's that same kind of 1970s, that's a 1970s movie poster, a lurid movie poster. That it's totally your style,
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about Disciples before I started drawing it, I think we were all on the phone together, and David brought up Russ Meyer and Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which is one of my favorite films. And even though I don't feel like tonally we totally get to that place, I just love that what that movie is sort of all about, and that sort of sensibility and the visual aspects of it. And so any time that I can kind of hopefully make any kind of reference to the 70s and that era of filmmaking and the crazy sort of horror movies that were being made, and the and giallo movies, which are another reason why I started making comics too, and something that I think we all share a love for. Anytime I can kind of do something related to those things, I'm super happy. That's sort of like, the place of creativity that you want to draw from.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember when I met you in Toronto, you sort of talked a lot about, you didn't really talk about your interest in comics. You talked about how like horror movies and exploitation movies were as much of a influence on your art, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I love comics. Obviously, I make comics, but for stories and storytelling, a lot of my inspiration is taken from movies and my experience watching movies, or just the culture of movies from like the 70s and then the 80s, which was when I was really growing up. Those have like really powerful experiences in my mind, and I think that that's what sort of comes out in the comics. I love to draw, but I need, like, I'm a draftsman first, so but I love making comics, so I need to pin these drawings onto a story, and the stories that come out are the ones that are sort of inspired by just like 1970s and 80s movies, mostly horror or just genre films in general, I guess.
Yeah, and the story of Disciples is very much like about a few different decades that are sort of intersecting, right?
Right.
It's sort of like the 60s and 70s and 80s, like intersecting with right now, without revealing too much. Yeah.
And I just want to say also that I like very much the style that he drew this in too. It really captures that 70s thing. He captures that specific thing that I like in those 70s movies, which is also, and again, I don't really have the language to describe this properly, but there's a starkness and almost kind of a primitivism sometimes in the drawing, and it reminds me a lot of in those 70s movies. They're much scarier than any like the slasher movies or whatever they made in the 80s, partly because you kind of felt like anything could happen in them because they weren't made by, they were clearly not made by a studio. They were clearly made by like some crazy guy in Texas with like a 16 millimeter camera. And you just kind of felt like, oh, this is not somebody who's going to be necessarily playing by the rules. I think we've also talked about like Assault on Precinct whatever, that begins with the child getting blown away.
Yeah.
On screen. And it's like and because John Carpenter wasn't known at that time, the very low budgetness of it and the kind of the grunginess of it.
Yes.
Made it that, oh my God, this could be this almost feels like a snuff movie or something. And your drawing, while being beautiful and elegant at the same time, also kind of has this kind of underground kind of quality to it, where you feel like, oh, this could get really nasty, basically.
Yeah, it's almost like you're like, who is this guy?
Yeah, it's like you're a crazy guy scribbling away in some basement or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's right, David, too. It's like that's the quality of like, you're sort of talking about like from a lot of those movies that were independent films from back then. And Texas Chainsaw, I guess, being the sort of king of that mountain, is sort of what was frightening about it is that there was this kind of lack of beauty that you associate with films. That there was always be this aesthetic attention to beauty in the way something was photographed and art directed and people were dressed, and that there was this sort of new time happening. And of course that went hand in hand with this lack of censorship and just culture going fucking insane. And so it's sort of like, yeah, there was a sense of a lot of those films where you're like, it's not just scary what you're seeing happening, but the style of it makes you think, who would even do this? Like, why would someone actually? It's like what's scarier, like the people who did this, or like what you're seeing portraying on screen? And I think that's right with like Ben's sort of stark style. It's like it's so simple. It strips away a lot. And I think, Ben, you thought about doing it in color for a while, didn't you?
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. I did several drafts of like the first 3 pages to try to nail down the color palette and like the application of color. What you can do these days, is you can simulate sort of old comic style coloring and I thought that would be appropriate, but I wasn't able to get it to a place where I felt like it nailed sort of how the story felt or how I wanted it to feel. And which is just like you guys were describing it, which is like that low budget quality of those horror films.
Or underground comics.
Or underground comics too. Yeah. Just that dinginess, that rawness, but I just wasn't able to get there. So, and I knew that layer of doing the coloring would add a whole nother, amount of time of production that I wasn't super keen on adding to the mix. So, just keeping it black and white was with some screen tones applied here
what
and
if
there.
We saw like that image that we were talking about before of that page, whatever page it is, it's like 8 or not, whatever it is.
I'm going to close the screen share for a minute because we're not going to let everybody see what we're scrolling past. It's too good. We don't want to spoil it.
It's filthy. It'd be upsetting things that they're seeing.
It's gonna made it bigger for everyone, so we'll scroll through the panels here.
Sure.
Yeah. I love that her dark face there, that first panel.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, she's. I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying that she's she's well lit in other parts of the story in her introduction, and so I wanted this shot of this character on the top left here to have her face all in shadow in this moment where things have kind of shifted in her personality. So she's now sort of like unknown to these two girls.
And she also is joined with the others, with her friends there who are showing up.
Right. Yeah.
And like you realize that it's not one person, there's many of them.
Yeah, I was super inspired by this inker, Klaus Janson, who's a legendary inker for Marvel Comics, who inked Daredevil during Frank Miller's famous run and inked Dark Knight Returns and among other incredible comics. And in the 1970s, he did some Conan magazine, like Savage Sword of Conan issues with John Buscema, and they're just like incredibly inked. And I wanted to sort of emulate his style, which is like so fresh, and so what he calls impressionistic inking. So I was trying to use the same kind of energy to ink these pages, which is a combination of a crow quill pen and brush. But I used the brush it was really loaded with ink, so the ink would just really go down very fast. Even the crow quill, like I would use nibs that the ink would just rush out of them to get onto the page. I wanted that speed to kind of help me. It was partly I wanted to have that feeling of freshness in the drawings. It also contributes a little bit to the raw quality, but also it sort of emulates. It's a style that was created for comics by necessity, because comics needed to be done super quick. The deadlines were, just a few weeks to create these things. So artists had to really move fast, and a lot of the style is them moving quickly to get pages done. So I wanted to kind of capture that with this book.
If we scroll down, that's like my favorite is like these 4 panels.
Yeah.
So cool.
I initially had some background in there, like just some foliage just done in screen tone to kind of give them something to sit on top of or push them forward with. But I ended up thinking that they worked better just without any backgrounds at all, just with clearer storytelling.
Yeah, you don't want to meet these girls.
No.
in the woods at night.
No.
And this is the last one we're gonna show
the
you
full
all.
page, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that ended up being really a fun page to draw in ink. And I felt like, whenever you do one of these comics, or at least for me, you're sort of during the first several pages discovering the visual identity of the book. And with each of my stories, I try to do something a little bit different with how I approach them drawing wise. And so I felt like on this page, the way it came down, this one sort of like cemented how the rest of the book was going to feel for me drawing it. So it definitely this sort of that's what I remember when I look at this page.
Mm-hmm. There's a story too with that moment that I just realized that David, one of the first conversations I had with you when we were sort of talking about Valley movies that would take place in the Valley, stories that would take place in the Valley, since you grew up in the Valley, and you just were talking about how different it was back then, and that there were woods there, and I was like, there are woods in the Valley by us? And I remember you said, yeah, and there was a trail, and we'd walk in the trail, and it would lead to this other street, and there was only one house there, and in that house there was a magician who lived there.
Oh, yeah.
That's like the most strange and magical thing.
No, it is true. It wasn't exactly woods. It was more like an overgrown, giant, vacant lot. But there was a house across that vacant lot, had a giant marquee of a very sinister, satanic, Anton LaVey-looking magician, and he was the great Dante. He was nice. Apparently his heyday was the 50s. He was very famous. I think he was dead already by the time I was born. Wow. But they still had his, I guess it was from Times Square or something, this giant marquee of him propped up in the backyard of the house. And my brother and I actually, when we like, it would be kind of like do a creepy crawl around the magician's house. It was actually quite scary because it was just in the backyard leaning against the house. And one time there was like a loud crack of a door opening. Somebody was coming out the back door. And we ran away. It was a very Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Spawn Ranch kind of vibe to that house. Yeah,
it sounds like a Stephen King opening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right, the magician who lives there.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, nothing that interesting actually happened, but
that idea, I think that's even in there in this story. Is like there's the character, I can't really talk too much about them. Who talks about how things were like in the Valley, like there's some dialogue that they're talking about how there used to shoot cowboys and Indians movies, and I remember them, and like it's sort of that idea of like this place that is changed before your eyes, like these characters who can sort of see it. I mean, all that just came from talking to you the first time. It's like how and how those films, like you can look at a movie. And it's like, I mean, David, you're a little bit older, so you saw a lot of those movies in a theater, which I didn't or Ben didn't. But it's also this idea of like, even you're thinking back on, when you look at films like that, especially exploitation films that were so low budget that they become documentaries of the place that they are, portraying. That it's like getting into this sort of window into another world, and sometimes it's really quite frightening. Like, what is that world that existed back then, where everyone looked different, and
Yeah, no, and especially I remember being very scared of the counterculture when I was a little kid. I remember my parents taking me to a hippie restaurant in Westwood, and in 1970 or something. It's like one of my real early memory, and like the waiters were all hippies, and it was dark with psychedelic posters on the wall, and it just reeked of drugs and Manson death or something. It was really really scary. Yeah.
It just, for anyone who's like watching or listening, but it's all sort of to the text of this story. in a way, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, that's one of the other things we sort of talked about. I think that first time was like also this idea of this sort of Manson version of the 60s and how that sort of hung over everything.
We've got some questions here from our lovely audience. One that we can have Ben start with and have you guys answer as well, from a friend of the store, I believe, Dash Shaw, asked if a comic can be scary. Not a movie, but a comic as you're reading it can be scary. And what is an example of a comic that actually scared you? Ben,
take that away.
Okay, so right, so yeah, Dash Shaw is a friend of Scott. He's also a friend of mine.
I figured.
Thank you, Dash, for the question. So I like to say this, but my first comic that I ever bought, that I went to buy like myself off the racks, was this comic called Space Beaver, which was done by this guy Derek Robertson when he was like 17 years old. Derek Robertson went on to draw Transmetropolitan and The Boys, most notably. But this was his first comic effort, and it was the first issue, and it was during the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle black and white boom, anthropomorphic animals, doing superhero stuff. So it was a science fiction story about this vigilante beaver and his like sidekick turtle, and it was incredibly violent. So it was these cute animals committing atrocities on these other animals, and so they were fighting this evil emperor who was like a pig. And there was this pinup in the back of the book. I'm pretty sure it was issue 1, of Space Beaver with a knife standing over this wolf guard who were like the stormtroopers, who he had just like gutted completely. And there was just blood everywhere, blood on all their fur, blood on the walls, blood on the floor. And the image terrified me so much that I couldn't turn to that page in the comic. I was like, in 5th grade or something like that. But it was just the ferocity and the gore, not just in the picture, but that Derek Robertson could conceive of this scene and then depict it in this way was so it was so emotionally charged for me. I couldn't even look at the picture. I was actually terrified of like the back of the comic. It's like I couldn't turn to it. So I eventually kind of got over that feeling. But I think that that's the kind of thing that when you're growing up and you're seeing some things in the world, maybe it's in movies or ideas presented in movies or in comics, that's when they can have the most effect on you. And I think that like since then I've tried to replicate the experience of reading that comic, that one issue, in all of the other comics that I've done.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's sort of in film. It's sort of like it's a more familiar experience in film where you encounter something, and it's when you feel like you're too young. And I don't know if there's an age cutoff for that, right? It's like, because someone could be 30 years old and just feel like they're too young for something
totally
to encounter. Yeah. So maybe someone is going to like some copy of Disciples is going to show up somewhere.
Is going to be that thing for somebody.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I'll have to think of a panel that could. There may have been a few as I was going through, but I was unable to stop scrolling. I had to keep going. I read it in one sitting.
Oh, good.
because it was that propulsive. And I can't wait for everybody else to get to do that as well. And so we've got another question here from Daniel, and we can start with we'll start with Nick and David on this one, and then move to Ben. He asked if there was something that you wish had made it into Disciples but didn't, either because it was voted down by the collaborators or it just didn't make it in. So maybe something that didn't make it into your final draft of the story. And then if Ben wants to chime in about any ideas maybe he had that didn't fit tonally or anything like that.
David,
I guess, yeah, there's, yeah, I think in terms of that self-cannibalization thing I was talking about, I do recall there's all kinds of images that I keep putting in these things, and then the movie never gets made, or it gets made and they don't do that part. So then I just take that scene and put it in something else, and it's like just playing like whack-a-mole or something like that. So I do remember there was one bit. There's a kind of a gender reveal thing in here, which I won't like spoiler get into. But I remember, yeah, I already did. But there's one thing I remember. I always liked. It's just always had this bit of a person having like somebody else's tattoo from a former lover, like sewn onto the breast, and then a bit of business to do with this kind of sewn on tattoo on the naked breast. And I remember liking that and being a little disappointed that didn't make the cut. But that's about the only thing I can think of, really. This one had a pretty good percentage of things making it in. I mean, it's a very small scale, compact thing, so there wasn't like a lot of room for my usual Baroque digression.
Well, there was I felt like I was the bad guy with a lot of that stuff, like that you would write, and then I would say, "Well, I don't know, no, we don't need all this stuff." But I just remember these amazing. There's like the whole thing. I guess it's like it's probably midway through the story when they're in the house, and there's the thing with the baby. Like it's like I remember you writing meticulous detail about the wood paneling, about like that's like, and it was something about the how they were speaking through this door, and it was this sort of very 70s style like wood paneling, and like and like you made a note about it. It's like it's the kind of thing that you see, and it was like, and I got so familiar with that in your writing, where it's like clearly there was some obsession that you were working out, but
yeah.
But I have to say that like so in the collaboration of the story, I feel like I was always the sort of dry one. I've directed a series of more or less commercial horror films, and and David wrote the movie that won the French fucking Oscar. Like he was the one who came up with this stuff that every time I would sort of get the story back, and there would be something new, like that moment when the character is telling that little story to the baby about the person that has made someone else. Like that's all David Birke, and I just feel like it was like sometimes you'd be just like a wind-up toy, man, when I just sort of put like give you the scene, and then I just get back this like gold. And of course the gold was completely perverted like so much of the time, but amazing. And so I don't remember anything specific. I was the one who was probably responsible for taking a lot of it out because
but also Nick's being very humble and self-deprecating there. But no, it's like I don't have the best track record of actually getting things made. That should be said. And Nick is well, it's French. It doesn't really count. But Nick really like knows how to like kind of like take things and kind of move them forward. And I think it's really to Nick's credit that it has the shape that it does. That it was something that Ben was able to work with. Basically, I think.
Yeah, sure. But and maybe someday there'll be a movie. But Ben,
and that would be nice. Yeah.
Well, if we want to jump on that real quick, I have more than one person asking in the chat if we may see a film adaptation of Disciples at any point in the future.
I mean,
If they have money, yeah.
I mean,
here's the Venmo to send it to.
Yeah. Right. So when we originally wrote it, and then Ben started to draw the comic, I was, attached as a director, and that was the idea. And I thought this was going to be the next thing that we're going to do. And then I ended up doing something else, and the producers had a different director that we approved, and he's like a really great guy. But we'll see what happens with that. It's sort of like, we have our fingers crossed, because I still it's like just preparing for this. I, was reading it again, not the script, but the comic. And I was like, I just would love to be able to do it, because it's, to see it get made in some form, because it's so filled with, sex and violence and twists and just sort of dark, warped things. And I love the idea of there being a movie that this graphic, and I think John Schoenfelder, the producer, that was his idea. It's like the comic just is going to exist as some brilliant other version of the same story, which will doubtlessly change in some way. And maybe too, Ben, it's a distillation of, because you didn't have to censor anything, Yeah. Not that it's so X-rated, but it's like, but it'll be, I like the fact that you sort of preserved this thing that we wrote. And in a way, that's the whole reality of filmmaking, is like a script is a blueprint for a movie, and it's always evolving in the circumstances of how the movie gets made. And so, films at the end of the day, they're not even finished. They're just abandoned, every one of them, that you just sort of, they land where they land. And so your sort of brilliant comic of this is one sort of iteration of this idea that David and I had, and you just brought it to this in this whole different place.
Yeah, but it's funny, when you just brought up the sex and violence in the story, I was just thinking about one of the things that you said to me before I started drawing it. You were like, I'm really curious to see how you handle the sex scenes. And I was like, yeah, me too. And when I started drawing them, I had with every intention to make them completely X-rated, because I feel like in comics, you can make the sex on the same level as the violence. Like, you can make it as explicit. And with Fantagraphics, they don't care either way. But I drew the sex scene with hardcore imagery initially, but I cut it out because it didn't feel like it fit into the story. It felt like it was taking away from what it felt like I was turning the story into Terror Assaulter in a little bit of a way. Yeah. And it was going to go to a place that I didn't want the reader's attention to go to. It felt like I was just doing it because I could do it, which is something that I did in Terror Assaulter, but that wasn't the point of this story. Right. So it felt like, in order to preserve the true spirit of the story that you guys told, that I didn't want to destroy that. I knew that if I had done that, it would have taken the reader right out of it. But I knew that if I kind of kept, it's pretty explicit still. I don't think you could shoot this scene that I drew and have it get anything but like an NC-17 rating. But
if you're talking about the scene where she cuts him, when she it's funny. It's like because that scene is just about her pleasure. That's probably why it would get fucking cut, right?
Right. Yeah. It's like
actually feeling something,
right.
But I wonder, it's sort of, that's and by the way, again, it's all. That was that conversation I had with David Birke. David, that idea was good. But, no, I think it's like that makes sense that you to hold back, and that was because the story is that she's experiencing pleasure in that. That's the point of the scene.
Right.
The point of the scene is that you get to ogle people having sex.
And like I wanted to do it like X-rated because I felt like, you know, like I said, with comics you're able to do that sort of thing, and you know, with movies you can't. And I kind of surprised myself because after I drew it, I read through it, I was like, this doesn't really work, you know, if I'm looking at it objectively, specifically for this story. And I don't know why. Maybe I don't know if it's like, you know, because I was seeing it like through the lens of like it as a screenplay and me as like a filmmaker with, you know, a comic book page, or what, but it just didn't seem to fit properly. But
yeah, no. And I'll say, when I did the last movie I directed, The Prodigy, I put a scene of full frontal male nudity, and a person who shall remain unnamed, who was the head of the studio at the time, was like, cut out the dick. And he's like, in like these scenes of like people being butchered, you know, like,
right.
like, you know, those were
Yeah.
fine, you know, a little kid saying like triple X-rated dialogue, like that was okay. But like
right.
the shot we had of a penis, you know,
No.
audiences don't want it.
And then we have a few more questions. Some of them we've already answered a little bit. But Ben, I'm going to throw sort of two-parter at you. First, someone wants to know if you are much of a Bernie Wrightson fan.
No, I'm not actually. I have a ton of respect for Bernie Wrightson, and when I was younger, I really liked Bernie Wrightson. And when I look at those Frankenstein illustrations, those are pretty insane looking. But it's funny, like I kind of grew out of Bernie Wrightson in a lot of ways. There are things that I really love about his stuff, and some of his comic book work I really like. Like his original Swamp Thing issues are pretty incredible. But you know, when I look at Bernie Wrightson's stuff, it just doesn't inspire me to draw. That's when I look at like art that I love, it's like stuff that really makes me want or feel compelled to draw after I see it. But yeah, I think he's an incredible artist, and it's not that I think he's like empirically like incredible. You can't argue with it. It's just not something that I tend to gravitate toward, unfortunately.
And then I've got a question for everyone, and we can go around the room, and this will be a great way to end our evening and leave people with some ideas of what they can read and watch before they get their hands on a copy of Disciples. Jim wants to know, how old were each of you when you started watching horror movies and when you started reading comics? So that's the main question. And then I figured you could leave us with a recommendation for what would be like a great first comic for someone to read, the first one ever, and also first horror movie to watch to get them into the genre.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Well, the first horror movie I ever saw was actually probably not really a horror movie. It was Barbarella, but there's a scene in Barbarella where she gets attacked by these dolls that have fanged teeth.
Oh yeah.
And it was, to this day, by far the most terrifying image I've ever seen in a movie. So I would recommend Barbarella as a good traumatizing thing. And also, I was never into comics at all, except I had there was an old copy of Creepy that I got my hands on when I was a kid, and it did have it was a horror comic, and there was one in there about Santa Claus crash landing on this island where there's all these starving children who look like ghouls are the only ones left alive, and they start by eating the reindeer, and then they eat Santa Claus. But it's just great because like as they're devouring Santa Claus, he's still filled with empathy for these starving little children. He's going, oh no, poor children, as they're eating it. It's really heartrending. So if it's possible to see creepy at all, like that, to me that was creepy or eerie. I get them confused sometimes, but those EC comics, they're considered campy now or whatever, but I thought they were genuinely terrifying. So that's it for me on comics.
Yeah, and I always was obsessed with the EC comics, and I really didn't read any others. And that all came from my interest in horror movies. And I still love those comics. And sort of several times in my life, I've cycled through, reading them, like the horror comics, but also the crime comics, and particularly the science fiction titles like Weird Fantasy. That art is just so beautiful. And I discovered at some point that my father had read them when he was a kid. And I dragged out an issue that he had described. He said, I remember reading this, and he described an EC comic to me. And I had it. And so I pulled it out and I thrust it in his hands, and then he read it and then didn't say anything. He just went about doing whatever he was doing. And I was like, this is one of the most beautiful pieces of art in the 20th century. Like, what do you think of this? And he was like, it was okay. I don't remember it being so melodramatic. That's what he said. And it's like, that's the thing. It's like, I think for us looking back in history, it's like, as we're of a different generation to look at those comics as works of art. I never really read comics contemporary, maybe some of the underground comics of the 80s and 90s. And it's funny, David, you mentioned like the first thing that's scary. It's like, there's so many great horror movies to recommend, but the movie that actually completely fucked up my head when I was a little kid, was I saw this movie on television called The Thing That Couldn't Die. And it was a black and white, late 50s horror movie, very obscure, still very obscure. And it was about this woman with a divining rod on a ranch is, looking for water, and the branch bends, and then she says, don't dig there, there's something evil. Of course they dig, and they find this chest, and when they open it, there's a severed head inside of it of a Satanist that will hypnotize you if you look in his eyes. And that movie, which I watched by myself on a black and white television in the basement, completely destroyed me and haunted me for years and years, and especially because I couldn't see it. It wasn't available. It never was released on VHS tape. Oh. And I finally got like a bootleg of it when I was about 18 years old, and it was like replaying a dream, because I had remembered specifically these moments. But there was a very, I had to go to the library and look up the title and reference books to know that this thing existed. So anyway, that's a movie and comic books.
I love stuff like that. For me, earliest comic was, I don't remember exactly, but I think my earliest comic book was the adaptation of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It was a magazine format, Marvel Comics production. And my mom gave it to me as like a present to occupy me while we were flying to Oregon to visit family one summer. And then for horror, I was like really scared of horror movies for a long time. But I remember as a very little kid, there being this promotion. I was obsessed with TV though. And I remember there being a promotion for watching Creature from the Black Lagoon in 3D on your TV. And there was, I think you got the glasses at like McDonald's or something like that.
7-Eleven.
Was it 7-Eleven? So I remember, and that part of it like was really awesome to me, because it was sort of like this treasure hunt in a way. Like you had to go and get the glasses in order to watch this event. So I got my dad to take me to like the 7-Eleven or something to get the glasses, and we got the glasses and ready to watch it. But we had a black and white TV, so it didn't work.
Yeah.
So it was just the creature from the Black Lagoon, kind of fuzzy.
Yeah.
So I kind of watched it. I think I watched a bit of it like that, but I remember my dad kind of explained to me, look, it just, if we don't have the right TV, it doesn't work. But me, like my kid logic, it still didn't like make sense that it wouldn't work, or that, for some reason we had done everything correctly, but it still wasn't going to happen. So I think that was, I guess, technically like my first horror movie that I sort of watched.
They're all like dreams.
Yeah.
All three of our experiences. They're all like that.
Well, before we wrap up, I'm going to see if I can bring Ben's camera up for a final goodbye so you can see that it was him the whole time. But thank you to everyone for sticking with us through our technical difficulties. Thank you to our guests, Benjamin Marra, David Birke, and Nicholas McCarthy, for chatting with us about all things Disciples. And if you have not ordered your copy of the book yet, you can order one from Skylight Books by using the shiny green button at the bottom of your screen. And sitting at my desk at the store are a big stack of signed book plates by all three of these guys that traveled around the country from one person to the next. And if you order a copy of Disciples from Skylight Books, it will come with one of those signed book plates. So you can do that by clicking the green button down at the bottom of the screen. And thank you all so much for joining us. We can't wait for you to get your copy of Disciples on June 28th.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
Okay.
You too.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.